Thank you all for coming. This is our presentation of our best master's thesis in Iowa history. We're really excited about this year's winner. His name is Seth Hedquist. Daryl, our assistant director, is going to introduce him in a second. This is the, boy, how many years we've given this? This is the 6th or 7th year we've given this this award, and I think this year it gives the edge to Iowa State. All our winners have been from Iowa or Iowa State. And I think this year it makes it 4-3 Iowa State. So we'll see how this competition goes. So with that, please welcome Daryl Sasser, who will introduce Seth Hedquist. And after the presentation, Seth will be interested in taking questions. I'm sure you'll have some. So we'll open it up to questions and then refreshments. Daryl.
Welcome to the 2016 Master's Award in Iowa History Thesis presentation. I'm really glad you're here. This year the award goes to Seth Hedquist for his work titled The Chronicles of Agri-Music. We're looking forward to hearing Seth talk about his work. Seth is a musician. In addition to being a historian, he was born and raised in Des Moines. He graduated from Iowa State University with a BA in history in 2009 and an MA in history in 2015. His graduate research focuses on rural musicians in Iowa from 1900 to 1940. When Seth is not researching and writing, he teaches guitar lessons to students of all ages and performs locally with groups of various styles. He's also familiar with Simpson College, and he's taught here in the music department. I've asked Seth to talk about his thesis for a few minutes, and then he's going to answer questions about the work that he's done and the process and graduate school, if you have questions about that. And then afterwards, as Bill said, there's refreshments, so feel free to linger. And please welcome Seth. Plaque for Seth, so you get to take that home with you.
Sweet. Thank you. And you have to turn for the photographs.
Oh, yes.
Where's the camera?
And let's put that in context as well.
I will. Well, thank you all for being here, and special thanks to the Iowa History Center for this award. It means a lot. It means more than I can say, really. This has really been a labor of love, as I told you in the initial email when you told me that I would be the recipient. That's not to suggest that it was fun all the time to research and write this. It did come with plenty of challenges, and I'm grateful to have had an advisor who helped me keep a cool head through the joy and the doubt. But I'm really grateful. I think the best gift for me that comes from an award like this, and why I'm so grateful to the Iowa History Center, is that we historians can't discuss anything if we're not reading anything. And this means for me that hopefully this will allow more people to read it and be aware of it and be aware of the message that I think it provides. Can everybody hear me okay? I should probably start with that. Awesome. I set out in my graduate school years to research what I've come to call everyday musicians. Musicians who could be your next door neighbor, who didn't necessarily have much name recognition, perhaps outside of their hometown or county, or maybe not even beyond their block. I was looking for a group of people that were a little bit more discreet, a little bit more anonymous than what we're sometimes used to seeing, because I think that if folk music, as we call it, is in fact the music of folks, then holding our icons, our so-called folk icons, a little too close can carry with it its own problems. In that those icons can soon begin to represent the whole of our definition of folk music and what it is, where I think it's best to not only listen to Woody Guthrie, but to sort of research the folk that he represented. And I love Woody Guthrie, but I think we know plenty about him. So I was trying to go further. Little did I know that what I thought would be sort of an innocent little tale about musicians in rural Iowa would lead to important questions, and I really think fundamental questions about power, about group participation. Just because people are singing the same song does not mean that they all necessarily believe in it or even want to be singing. And I would ask that you think even for a moment about our current discussion on the Star-Spangled Banner and what we're seeing with that. Even before some athletes decide to sit or kneel, the camera shows people standing. So I'm talking about distinguishing support, genuine support for an idea or an ideology or for other people, genuine support from the so-called show of support, because show of support implies that there's some show aspect. It may be grounded in some reality, but it does not necessarily show the whole of the reality. So power, group participation, and then community spirit, identity, and value. Now, I use those words somewhat interchangeably. I'm sure if we had a little more discussion, we could maybe draw some distinctions. But this study led me to communities. So I inevitably ran into questions of community spirit, identity, and value. Are these qualities that a few organizational leaders or heads of state can infuse or inject into a group, or do groups already have identity? And then a couple more questions, just to kind of keep in the back of your mind as I continue forward. Is the productivity of a certain community an appropriate means to measure the value of that community? And who gets to do the measuring? So just a few things to think about. The musicians that you read about in that middle chapter of the thesis, I assigned that one because it just gets you right into the middle of who these agri-musicians were. The musicians, these music communities that you read about, were spirited, ongoing communities that found opportunities through their local farm bureaus for furthering, not necessarily creating, social interaction in the country. Yet leaders who promoted institutional participation in the country had their own designs by tapping into local music communities and giving them never-before-seen playing opportunities. You read about some of those with pageantry and radio performances. Giving them never-before-seen playing opportunities, agricultural leaders were able to create a show of support for agricultural organization in the country. And in doing so, they tried to convince their constituents and prospective supporters that rural America's prosperity and value were not only at stake, but dependent, and that's a key word, dependent on agricultural organizations like the Farm Bureau. The tragedy in this tale, and I hate to put that word into a story of musicians, but I think there is an element of tragedy in this tale, is that some of the musicians you read about, I think, believed what experts told them. They, in other words, fell for the myth that identity and value could be achieved in accordance with some expert's definition of those qualities. Okay? Now, incidentally, like I said, I started you right in the middle of the thesis, and if you have any questions, I'll kind of gloss over that. But I wanted to actually give you some context, just in case there's any terminology or characters that stand out that you're really not quite yet sure about. So I wanted to lead you into that a little bit, that chapter that you were assigned. This, incidentally, did start off as a paper about one man, Thomas Mann, a farmer from Dallas County, Iowa, and a musician. He had about 50 acres of mostly corn, some alfalfa. But in 1937, a representative of the Library of Congress came to his home, knocked on the door, and wanted to record the music that he could play on his hammered dulcimer. And I thought this would be a cool story to kind of investigate. This sounds like sort of a 1 in a million opportunity for this particular quiet Dallas County farmer who also happened to play this unusual instrument called the hammered dulcimer. As I began to research his life more and read about the kinds of events that as a rural musician he played at, I began to discover that the communities with which he performed at a lot of Farm Bureau events in the 1920s especially. This started sort of an inner crisis within because, man, I had found one of these everyday musicians. He found sort of a 1 in a million opportunity, but he still sort of seemed to personify this idea of the everyday musician. That and with his community as well. But at the same time, I was beginning to read about the fact that the organization that he was playing on behalf of, according to some historians, did not necessarily represent the best interest of rural communities at this time. So there's my research question. Whether I wanted it or not, I got it. So it was inconvenient. it started this sort of inner crisis because I love musicians, but you know, this organization, according to some historians, again, did not act in the best interest of communities. So the question became why? Why would this community of musicians, Thomas Mann's community of musicians, play on behalf of an organization that did not necessarily act in the best interest of rural communities, according to some prominent historians? And I'll hit on the historiography towards the end. Give you a little bit more background. Theodore Roosevelt, as some of you may know, I don't know if we have any agricultural or rural historians in here, put together a commission, the Country Life Commission in the early 1900s, in 1909, to assess the state of rural America at the time. Because this commission and its supporters and its followers had some fears about rural America. That is, that the rural American population was steadily declining. Cities, by contrast, were growing and growing fast, and without any real cohesive strategy for how to take in all these people, not only from the countryside, but immigrants from other countries as well. So they wanted to assess the state of rural America and try to figure out how they could make rural life more attractive and farming as an industry more economically sound. They wanted to make farmers more efficient so they could not be poor. I mean, there's the old saying, to be a farmer is to be poor. They didn't want that. They wanted farmers to have the necessary means, tools, and methods for farming that would make farming more efficient. But they also had, this commission also had ideas and social concerns. Concerns not necessarily dealing with the economic side of things, but they feared this thing, this sort of buzzword in my thesis, social isolation. They were worried that people in rural America just weren't hanging out anymore outside of the church. So they wanted to find ways to institutionally create more social opportunity in the countryside. And what does that mean? Well, we can sort of ask the leader of this country life movement, and he was the leader of the commission, but he was also he really championed this movement, this country life movement, to create more social opportunities in the countryside. This is Liberty High Bailey, and he was the chair of the Commission on Country Life, appointed by Theodore Roosevelt. But he also had some things to say, incidentally, about music in the countryside. He said, quote, "The music spirit seems to be dying out in the country." This isn't a follow-up work to the 1909 report. He wrote this about 10 years later. "The music spirit seems to be dying out in the country. I hear very little joyous song there, even though the people may be joyous. The habit of self-expression in song and music needs much to be encouraged in home and school and grange and church. I think the lack is in part due to the overmastering influence of professional town music." He's calling out some enemies. "And in part due to the absence of study of simple country forms. Simplicity is not now the fashion in music. The single player with a simple theme and the single singer with a melodious and untrilled strain are not much heard at gatherings now. Some of the best singing I hear now and then out among the folk. A simple, direct song as plain and sweet as a bird's note. I hope we shall not lose it." It's beautiful prose, but I think it's kind of a myth. Okay, the music spirit was changing, to be sure. But it was not dying. It just didn't necessarily look, or shall we say, sound the way that Liberty High Bailey would have preferred. Now, a myth is somewhat harmless until people start to actually believe it. And I think, again, the problem in Iowa is that a lot of people did sort of believe this to some extent, evidenced by the institutional recreation events, some of which you read about in the chapter you were assigned. Philosophies like these represented not necessarily the beginning of, but an acceleration of reformist efforts to institutionally create more social opportunities in the country, centered around a prosperous agricultural economy, and local musicians would often be the foot soldiers in carrying out some of those aims. Now, in addition to these concerns about social life in the country, the Commission praised the efforts of agricultural colleges, like Iowa State College here, for their work in finding new and improved methods for farming. The Commission wrote, quote, "Each state college of agriculture should be empowered to organize as soon as practicable a complete department of college extension so managed to reach every person on the land in its state with both information and inspiration. Now, in order to get that information and inspiration to all of the people on the land, colleges needed liaisons, or agents. You'll remember from the chapter you read, county agents. This is what they were and this is what they did. This idea, this notion of farmers sort of banding together to actually bring in an expert, and a lot of these experts, these county agents were graduates of agricultural colleges. The idea of bringing these people in, some of these groups became known as farm bureaus. This idea of bringing these people in also quickened during the 1910s and especially during World War I and immediately after, so that by shortly after World War I, every county in Iowa had an agricultural agent. But pretty soon the bottom fell, and some of you may be familiar with this. Demand was steadily declining in Europe as our European allies started to rebuild and produce for themselves. And pretty soon, farmers who had taken out loans, largely at the advice of agricultural experts, taken out loans for more equipment and more acreage, soon found themselves in a destitute situation. They were overproducing and prices were falling, okay? And very quickly, relatively speaking, farmers entered into the farm crisis of the 1920s. Now, in crisis, leaders often attempt to rally their people, right? And you read about the manifestations of that rallying cry. And I call this segment of the presentation sort of a, is it a rally or is it a call to arms? Because steadily, these county farm bureaus were going from these sort of county cells that were really tied to local communities to becoming more of a sort of fused together political interest group, because this is a time of crisis. So they started to look to government in new ways that they hadn't before. So first of all, a rallying cry. You need an anthem. You read about the song, Boost the Farm Bureau. The farmers' time had come. Other eras of history carried with them songs, anthems, and for some of these agricultural experts and many farmers, it was time to have a song that they could sing that sort of epitomized their collective struggle as farmers, okay? So you read about that anthem in that context. You read about how farmers' meetings, according to some county agents, could be boring as hell. So why not have some local musicians actually bring their instruments to spice up the otherwise commonplace proceedings at farmers' meetings? You read a little bit about that as well. You read about agricultural college tours. Those county agents, incidentally, did not just take information from the colleges to the counties. What about the idea of actually bringing counties to agricultural colleges? And that's what they did. I think you read about the Grundy County College tour, among others, where 40 people packed into 40 cars and drove up to Iowa State to tour the agricultural experiment station, to see all these new methods for farming that were being practiced. And some people were lucky enough, some counties were lucky enough to be invited back, or to have musicians from their county invited back to play on the radio. Some musicians were unfortunate enough to have their radio appearance, which these were entertainment programs. This was predominantly a music program. The Grundy County Farm Bureau played music for most of its radio reign. But you read about how some people could be frustrated if a boxing match interrupted their program. So, incidentally though, it wasn't just Grundy County. This idea of having Farm Bureau radio programs was at a peak in 1926. You also read a little bit about county pageants, historical pageants. All of these things, with the exception of the radio, which was an asset that the Country Life Commission couldn't necessarily have foretold. Pageants, spicing up farmers' meetings, those kinds of things, these were all things that the Country Life Commission praised, okay? And the Country Life movement. And the Farm Bureau was putting them into practice. So you read about historical pageants, and you read about how all of these things, radio performances, pageantry, were sort of part of this rallying cry, and how they also coincided with this heated political debate on Capitol Hill going on at the time, the McNary-Haugen movement. Legislation designed to help farmers by getting them better prices for their yields. And production surplus That was to be the problem of the government, were this bill to go through. A government association or agency would buy up the nation's surplus and try to find markets for it elsewhere, but it was not to be the farmer's problem anymore, okay? Incidentally, even though it passed in both the House and the Senate, Calvin Coolidge vetoed it twice. So by the time the Great Depression had hit and the 1932 election came around, a lot of these agricultural experts and a lot of farmers were not about to set their hopes on a Republican anymore, so they turned to Franklin Roosevelt. And hopefully I left you and the chapter you read on a little bit of a cliffhanger to kind of make you read on. But indeed, as the Farm Bureau sort of made an ally of President Franklin Roosevelt, along on the campaign trail in 1932, they did find enemies within his administration. They got a lot of what they wanted in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It sort of echoed some of the things that the McNary-Haugen bill was championing. So, as we entered the 1930s, the Farm Bureau was starting to pick up some political steam. It felt like it started to find an ally in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but it did have some enemies, like I said. One of those was the Resettlement Administration, led by a group of people who felt like organizations like the Farm Bureau and some of the legislation that they were for helped some farmers, not others. They felt like the Farm Bureau only helped middle to wealthy landowners, okay? But that efforts to alleviate chronic rural poverty were largely just not happening. So there was a whole class of poor farmers and poor rural folks throughout the United States who were not being looked at or addressed. Okay, so the Resettlement Administration sought to create government-sponsored planned farming communities where residents who applied and were accepted could farm 5 to 6 acres while balancing part-time farming with seasonal wage work. So if you were a coal miner taking time off and you were off-season, you weren't necessarily out of a job. You could farm a small plot of land and sell your produce locally, okay? Incidentally, the Resettlement Administration had a music program as well. Musicologists, they hired professional musicians to go into these planned communities and try to strike up music programs. Kind of sound familiar. So, they tried to do this. They tried to organize dances, they had music lessons, they tried to work within local schools to sort of integrate these planned communities into the outer communities as well. They also had a music recording program. And this is where the woman on your right comes in. She was an employee of the Resettlement Administration. She worked in the D.C. office, but she had a desire to take the phonograph machine that they had sitting around in the D.C. office and take it out into the country and record the music of a lot of people. They were particularly targeting the elderly generation, worried that older folks who knew songs from their childhood when they had grown up in the 1870s and 1880s, they were worried that if these folks died and we didn't have any representation of the music they grew up with, it would be lost forever. So she traveled, she just took solo trips throughout the country. She went to the Ozarks, she went to the northern lumber region of Wisconsin, trying to record the music of just about anybody she could. And the amount of music she recorded is really astounding, and it's also neat to go to Washington, D.C. and read the letters of her travels as well. Incidentally, she also, for one man, drove to Dallas County, Iowa when she was working in Austin, Minnesota. She took a little detour down to Dallas County, Iowa, and recorded the man on your left, and the photo of the man on your left and his wife, Lucy. But she wanted to record his music because he played this unusual instrument called the hammered dulcimer, this trapezoid-shaped instrument that had been around for about 5 centuries. He hand-built them and played them. He learned how to play from his English-born father. His father, Thomas Mann Sr., came from England and knew a lot of old English dance music that the Library of Congress would find particularly interesting about Thomas Mann's repertoire. So, she recorded the music of Thomas Mann, 17 songs. The thing about his repertoire is, here he is part of a somewhat conservative farmer organization, and I already talked to you about Liberty Hyde Bailey's dream of sort of routing out, or at least holding at bay, professional town music influence from coming into the country. Let's keep it simple. Let's keep it a nice, simple country melody. Let's study more styles like that. As it turns out, Tom Mann's repertoire, and this is part of the research project. Sorry, I'll go off on a little side here. We're all interested in research, but I wanted to figure out ways to use his repertoire as a historic source, because to me, I had a cultural artifact, but for a long time, I did not necessarily know how to use it. So I started to treat Tom Mann's repertoire as if it was sort of his journal, which proved to be really helpful for me. And as you may well know, diary keeping, it was more common in the 1800s. Once we get to the 1900s, diary keeping began to fall off. It wasn't non-existent, but we have fewer diaries, we as historians. So I figured if I could use his repertoire to ask questions like, well, what was he playing about? That might help this research somehow. And as it turns out, his repertoire was very expansive, stylistically speaking. Okay, he not only played his English-born father's repertoire, old English dance music that immigrated to the United States. He played pop songs from the 1920s on this unusual instrument. He played songs that you might associate with the country, but that still actually developed in urban centers. Songs like Buffalo Girls. If you've read the Little House books, you know Pa would grab his fiddle, and that was one of the songs he played. So Tom Mann recorded that song as well. Incidentally, Buffalo Girls, other songs, maybe you know the titles, Little Brown Jug. These were songs that started to make their way into the country, and country musicians, or musicians in the country, had steadily adopted over the years, making you think that they originated in the country, but they did not. These were published songs that city songwriters often wrote. So his repertoire was so much more expansive than Liberty Hyde Bailey's definition and idea for music in the country should look like. So therefore, Tom Mann's repertoire exposes the romanticism of Liberty Hyde Bailey's music definition for country music, and the show. It exposes the show that agricultural leaders wanted to put on, and how it did not necessarily accurately represent the whole of the reality. Okay? Now, Tom Mann still was an ardent Farm Bureau member, but he didn't necessarily adopt all of the definitions that went along with that and the things that agricultural experts like Liberty Hyde Bailey would have wanted to see. He was open-minded when it came to music. He wasn't some rigid traditionalist, okay? So hold that in mind, because all of that primary research wouldn't be possible. Oh, I'll show you pictures of the hammered dulcimer a little bit more up close. This is not a random photo off the internet. This is actually his hammered dulcimer. His granddaughter has been awesome in letting me not only come over and see these things firsthand, but she initially sent me these photographs, and she's been great, been very cooperative, and just very nice to me. They're beautiful instruments, and like I said, he hand-built them. He built about 10, probably in his lifetime. She has 2. And so, yeah, it's just been a real treat to kind of see these things firsthand. But I promised you some historiography, because all of that primary research, as you know, wouldn't be possible without the support of other sources. It was Mary Neff who I was reading when I first began to discover, I'm discovering some Farm Bureau musicians here, but what did the Farm Bureau do? And so it was Mary Neff who sort of challenged me to think about this topic in new ways, all right? And she read some things, and I'm so sorry if the font is kind of small, but things like large membership, okay? By the early 1920s, the Farm Bureau had 100,000 members. That was huge. And they grew from 40,000 inside of a year. But 100,000 members, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those members were loyal in the same way. So Mary Neff challenged me to think, and she is quoted as saying, make certain factors like large membership make equating membership with full acceptance of their agricultural policies somewhat questionable, and that to participate in larger statewide shipping associations or terminal markets coordinated by government agencies, some farmers had to join farm bureaus, okay? Implying that farm bureau membership was not always a simple choice. Sometimes it was a string attached to other opportunities, okay? So she definitely challenged me to think about this in a deeper way. If you want to read, I've got some more quotes from her as well. Preserving the family farm is an invaluable source if you are interested in rural, agricultural, or women's history in rural America. It's an excellent source to check out. A couple other just poignant examples. As you might know, or maybe have guessed, there's not a whole lot written about rural Iowa musicians. Okay, so I had to try to think of outside the box in terms of the historiography, okay? So, I knew my story fit into sort of an agricultural history framework as it was already, okay? And rural history. So I would try to find books on rural history, agricultural history. But the most interesting find, one of the most interesting finds was looking at organizations, agricultural organizations, as really just another product in the consumerist fold. So I began to look at consumerism in the countryside, and there are some fantastic works that have been written. And also technology, even a little bit of technology. So buying a car, for example, this was an important thing. Cars were becoming very popular in the 1910s, not just in cities, but in rural areas as well. But Hal Barron wrote that buying a car, quote, did not necessarily represent an embrace of a new consumer culture and a rejection of older agrarian precepts. Just because you had a car and you lived in the country didn't mean that you fully embraced all manner of new consumerism that was coming your way, okay? It was a convenience. It worked for you, all right? And then another thing, and again, this is what made me want to start putting organizations sort of on the shelf like any other consumer product, in a way. David Blanke wrote, from purchasing cooperatives and the country store to the Grange and the Farm Bureau, these institutions were created, used, and frequently discarded by rural consumers in interesting and instructive ways. The Farm Bureau, like automobiles, or like whatever the new piece of technology that came to the country home, worked for some people for a time. And just because they maybe took part in a Dallas County pageant that attracted 17,000 people did not necessarily mean that they held the same values. In other words, high membership should not necessarily be the only factor in determining the success of an organization. Not just the Farm Bureau, but anywhere. Okay, we need to look deeper. And one's membership should not be the determinant factor in measuring that person's loyalty to the organization's aims and ideals. Just because they signed on doesn't tell you everything. We need to go deeper when it comes to organizational history, okay? Now, in addition to historiography, I just want to make one more note, because this I hold, this is a heart value. This one comes deep. As you research, as you continue to research, because you're all historians and you love research, but you probably have encountered times where you're looking a little too hard, okay? And maybe you need to back off. I would just say, because it means so much to me, once in a while, take the time for recreational reading if you're not already. Read a chapter of Harry Potter. I finished the whole series while I was researching this. I would just read a chapter in the morning before I would start my research, okay? The Narnia books, you named it. I read a lot of things that had nothing to do with what I was researching, because you never know what witnesses might await you. All right, now I'm going to leave this on kind of a cliffhanger, because I read these two books also for recreation. They are now both in my introduction. I did not have any intention when I picked these two books of doing research. They've been invaluable for helping me look at my research in new and different ways, okay? So just don't look too hard, and if you catch yourself looking too hard, pick up something else, anything. But I was shocked when I opened up the pages of some of these books and read some of the things I read. I made some connections that I would not have otherwise found had I been looking and looking and looking and looking. So take time for fun reading. I hope that this thesis And again, special thanks to the Iowa History Center, because I really believe that reading it is a start. I hope that as more people do read this, that it serves as a message for organizations to always be aware of their own inner workings, so as to maintain total integrity with their clientele. I hope, additionally, that this work can be a message for all of us to embrace community while still being able to think for ourselves, and not to forget that we are all individuals. And finally, and this is sort of more of a, I just talked about organizations looking within. I would challenge us all to do the same. I hope this will be a reminder to individuals to be aware of when we begin to allow our bodies, this organization, to get too organized around some of the myths we create in our heads. Okay? And with that, again, I am so thankful to the Iowa History Center. It means so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I don't think there's a greater gift than being able to actually look your readers in the eyes. You know, we spend so much of our time in a dark room. Maybe I'm just speaking to myself. But I get up really early in the morning and I just start writing before the sun comes up. But it's good to actually be able to speak this topic in front of people. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the award. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And questions, if there are any. All right. Punch and cookies. No. Yes, sir.
What was one piece of information that you researched that you thought was extremely interesting, but just didn't really fit in what you were going to argue about? So it was one thing that you researched that you thought was like really interesting, but you just didn't feel that it really fit in your narrative.
That's an excellent question. Reminds me of how I've heard film directors talk about how they have to just dump that scene that they really like because it just doesn't fit the cohesive whole. That's a really good question. When I was initially studying Tom Mann, I would, too, get wrapped up in sort of this idea of the individual, thinking that he was important by himself, or that and he is, and we all are. But there were certain fun facts about him as an individual that I sort of had to leave in order to just keep this about agri-music, keep it about the message, really. And I could have gotten sidetracked in some ways. I hope you find sources that make you laugh. There were other instances where I would be looking through, for example, the WOI radio records up at Iowa State, and found some really cool band names. The Mono Motor Oil Twins and Banjo Boys, try that one out. But they were not related to the Farm Bureau. Now, maybe I do want to write a paper on them someday, but I'll have to leave that one by the wayside. That's a really good question. I know there are some other examples that I'm forgetting, but yes. There was one discussion on the rural church that I was trying to form an argument around and just didn't feel like I had enough to do it, to say. But as Liberty High Bailey mentioned, he wanted to use churches to actually sort of disseminate some of this information into counties or to spread it. And I started to have a page. I know I still have it somewhere. Bible verses and all, but it just didn't work. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Why do you think it is, in terms of the recordings that were done of folk music? It seems like the Alan Lomax recordings, which were done around the same time, I guess, of Southern folk music, particularly the blues, that like has tremendous cultural capital now. Why do you think it is that the folk music from the Midwest just isn't known? I didn't even know that it had been collected in the same way that the Southern stuff had. So what's with the imbalance there?
I think it's partly because the Midwest is harder to define. The Midwest has not been ravaged by conflict in the same way that the South has. We don't question regions like New England and Appalachia, and I say Appalachia because I know a guy from West Virginia who would tackle me if I said Appalachia. He got on me one time. But also the South. I mean, we don't really question the legitimacy of that region as a region. The West, for example. I took a class on Midwest history in the first class, and I don't even know if we really solved anything, but we just talked about what is the Midwest? Where do the borders start? You know, it's easier to define with the South. That's part of it. I also think Alan Lomax did go to Wisconsin for sure. But his trips with his dad, John, also that father-son pair going to southern penitentiaries and to places in the South, are very well recorded, very well cataloged, and collections are online. And other ventures elsewhere. You ask a really good question, because I think that it is wholly wrong that Sidney Robertson does not get the credit that she deserves. She was in Wisconsin in the summer of 1937, gathering contacts, recording the music of a lot of people. There are, through the University of Wisconsin, I think you can hear a lot of that collection. She went out to California after recording Tom Mann's music and recorded Spanish Desperado music, Russian Molokan music. I mean, and it's really interesting to me because they house these things. She then sent these recordings to the Library of Congress, which really I think is interesting because this archive in the library was called the Archive of American Folk Song, which makes you think that Sidney Robertson had a definition of American that was very, very advanced for its time. If she's wanting to put music where they're singing in Spanish, all that kind of stuff in the American, it was only about a decade old at the time, this Archive of American Folk Song. She does not get the credit she deserves. She went to Wisconsin in 1937. A year later, Alan Lomax capitalized on some of those contacts. So if you hear people say the name Alan Lomax, please say the name Sidney Robertson as well. She's just been astounding to read about. And her collections are just extensive. And the California one is actually where I found Tom Mann. It is digital. It is online through the Library of Congress. It was the Archive of American Folk Song. Now it is the American Folklife Center. That's what it's called now. Her collection of California folk music, it's called California Gold, is online. And if you scroll down the list of performers, you'll see California, 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 Iowa, California, California, California. That was really weird to me. So that's how I found out about it. So you can hear some of his recordings online. And then I went to the Library of Congress and heard the rest of the collection. But I hope that answers your question. But I think that's part of it. I think part of it is that, I don't know, if gender bias doesn't play a little bit of a role. I think John and Alan Lomax deserve credit, but she is definitely down here, and she should be up here.
Was it on wax?
A phonograph machine. So they were little discs. Yeah. So, yep. Really good question. Yes, sir.
How do the county fairs fit into agri-music?
That's a good question. I think sometimes the Farm Bureau was able to actually just kind of put their name on some of the county fairs and some of the events that went on there. Or at least they were present. Okay. The interesting thing about some of these bands, and really a centerpiece to the argument, is that they predated their farm bureaus. So some of these bands were already playing at county fairs, but they could conform to whatever the circumstance allowed. So that's why I talk about how the Cadwell Orchestra, which was that opening photo that you saw. This is the sorry, going fast. Rewind. This is the Cadwell Orchestra. In Dallas County. So we think, actually Tom Mann's granddaughter gave me this photograph, and we also think Thomas Mann is third from the left. They could conform to any playing circumstance. So in the county agent annual reports, and by the way, that's if you're interested in rural history, county agent annual narrative reports. I use these a lot because county agents not only kept tabs on production in certain counties, farming production, but they also noted noteworthy events that took place in that given year, okay? But again, they could kind of just be a little bit of a chameleon. So the Cadwell Orchestra was the Cadwell Orchestra. It was the Dallas County Orchestra. It was the Dallas County Farm Bureau Orchestra. But the Dallas County agent kept a short list of people, and Shawnee Cadwell was at the top of that. And so I think, Farm Bureau musicians were participating. So, yeah, definitely present at those events. Yeah.
And one connection to the county fair, it's not quite a county fair, but I know the Old Settlers Days are still going today. Back in the 19-teens and 20s, there were actually old settlers still alive. Part of the program, they'd have different people come up and speak about what we used to eat, you know, how we used to farm, that kind of thing. And oftentimes there would be someone get up and sing some of the old songs, you know.
Oh, cool.
And so that would be preserving the music that Liberty
Yeah.
Guide was
Yeah.
well, it wasn't preserving, it was just performing it. I'm
Sharing
sure
it, I mean,
none of it got recorded, I'm sure.
in a way, it is preserving, and, you know, cultural preservation is a huge part of this, because it is, you know, this work is very largely about how people continue to share their music and try to preserve it, so that's interesting, though. We gotta hang out. Again, it's been too long, so. Any other questions? What are you guys working on? What are some, you're in, this is a historiography class, right? Anybody want to raise your hand and share your topic? Is it rural history generally that you guys study here, or are you picking anything? The doors are wide open? Anything?
And in this, their major project is actually a historiographical review, so they're not doing, straight research
Original
paper.
research.
Yeah, they're not doing original research, but
Right.
they do that in some of their other classes. But, yeah, so, yeah, what are some of your histo review topics, people?
The causes of the Civil War.
Rise and fall of the in wars.
Oh, interesting.
Capital punishment in Britain.
Neat.
I know we were going down a line.
Well,
Role of women in the Second World War.
awesome. Cool. Good.
Yeah, just Los Alamos for the Manhattan Project.
Oh, interesting. Cool. Very cool. Is anybody finding it, I mean, so this is historiography.
Right.
Is anybody finding it boring? And if you are, that might be hard to raise your hand and say your teachers. I don't know. Okay. I thought it would be the biggest drag to write a historiography, but I was wrong. I actually found it to be much more exciting than I thought. Once I figured out how to make the authors the new characters in the history. And I tried to put Mary Neth and David Blanky and all these folks sort of in my mind in a room and imagine them just sort of duking it out, maybe agreeing at times, but maybe not all the time. and imagining that as a historic event that I will then turn around and write about. So if that should help, but that's just me. I don't know.
Seth, maybe you could give some of our students tips about graduate school, something about either applying to graduate school or anything like that. I know some of these students might be considering graduate programs in history.
Okay, yeah. I loved graduate school. I missed graduate school. My favorite thing, and I'm not kidding, what were the seminars. You take hour-long classes now. Imagine these 3-hour seminars where you just pour over a book with a group of intelligent people, and then maybe go out for a beer afterwards. It's just awesome. It's just awesome. In any case, I went to Iowa State, as Dr. Sasser mentioned. I felt the program really fit what I was trying to do. I had gone to Iowa State as an undergraduate. I guess it's hard to talk about this without knowing some of your dreams in history. I mean, anybody envision themselves teaching in academia or teaching down the road generally? Yeah. Do any of you have specific questions about graduate school and the experience? I mean, I could talk for a while, but I don't know if I would hit on any of your specific questions. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you said that you graduated in 2009, and then you graduated from graduate school in 2015. Did that take longer than you expected, or was that kind of what you were planning on?
I'm a stubborn guy sometimes, and I guess I just went back to graduate school on a part-time basis because I did not want to wholly give up my profession as a musician. So I wanted to keep teaching music, and I teach private lessons and play gigs, and I love it. And in a way, it balanced me out. So I enrolled in 2011 for graduate school, and so it took me about 4.5 years. That's not the way it would work for everybody, but it really helped me. Again, to sort of back to that idea about not focusing too hard for too long. Like I would have work to go do that wasn't necessarily related to my research, and it helped me, keep a sort of a balance in life. But I understand that doesn't work for everybody, and a lot of people truck through full time, and they take on a TA position right away, and And, you know, most of the people in my program took that route. And it was a good group of folks, and I think we really enjoyed each other's time. And so everybody had their own avenues that they were going down, but yes, short answer to your question is it did take longer for me because of that. Yeah.
Do you have any research ideas or topics that you wanted to do that either your advisor or yourself are like, not know about besides the world church thing that you're talking about?
I definitely have other ideas currently, and I did then too, but they just had to be shelved. But none that I necessarily brought up in front of my advisor. Well, that's not true. I'm trying to think what some of those would be. I'm not sure if I'm even touching on your question. So you're wanting to know if I had ideas that my
So I
advisors.
guess like how difficult the process was for you to narrow down on you wanted to do rural musicians in the everyday musician.
Okay, great question. I was in charge of the research, but I tried to let the research lead me. So it was really, I feel like it's more of a philosophical answer to your question, you know, I had ideas for what I wanted to study for a while. That was Thomas Mann. I wanted to know his life and prove why he was important. That turned out not to be the direction I took it, though, because once I was done with that chapter, and by the way, I wrote that first and then wrote the whole thing backwards. Not literally, of course, that would be really hard. But no, his chapter was the first that I wrote, the one that he's featured in. But then I became impressed by this idea of the farmer musician, just broadly. I began to gather more research questions along the way as some of the ones I shared with you. So, and it sort of grew on its own. But I guess it's sort of like keeping a garden. You tend it, but you also have to just walk away and come back to it and see what new developments there are. Does that help answer your question? Okay.
Any more questions? Well, I think we should give Seth a hand. We can visit with him privately if you wish while we're enjoying some treats. So, thank you very much.